Amen. Thank you, Breck. All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We're going to cover some of the basics just so we're all on the same page. So we're going to go kind of large scale. What's the world? What's Corinth like? Then we're going to kind of zone in. We're going to zoom in to the territory that chapter 13 finds itself in, especially chapter 12, 13, and 14. And then we're going to zoom even further in all the way down to the chapter itself and the verses we're looking at, which is chapter 4 through verse 4 through 7, which is kind of the most famous of the verses. And how many of you had 1 Corinthians 13 read at your wedding? Okay, lots of people. I think Chandler and Bryce will probably come. I officiated their wedding. They wanted it read, so we read it. And so we're excited to jump in. So as always, this first page is a lot of information. I'm going to touch on a few things, but if you're feeling like we're going really fast, this is more of a resource for you than it is for me just to cover every little thing. So the Corinthian church was planted by Paul, okay? So this is how the church came to be and how the city of Corinth came to be. It's actually a very interesting story. Corinth sits on an isthmus. Is that how you say that? Isthmus? This is what happens when you just read and you don't listen to things. Isthmus. It is a strip of land, and it's about 4 miles wide, and it connects the Aegean Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And what Corinth had done is they had dug basically a small Panama Canal through the 4 miles, and it offered the ability for people to more or less ship things from Asia all the way into the Mediterranean Sea, which was a huge deal in the ancient world. The less time at sea, the higher likelihood that you get to live. Yeah, exactly. That you get to keep breathing and you get to stay alive. And so this was a big deal. So if you can imagine a place where all things come together, it's a major shipping port, it's kind of east meets west in one place, it's Roman, it's Greek, it's everything all in one. It's this huge, wealthy metropolis. But something actually happened to it. About 200 years before Paul plants this church, the Romans are on the move and they actually They utterly destroy Corinth, which was a Greek stronghold, and they just leave it. It's just desolate. All the survivors, they just scatter and they go find a new place to live. But Julius Caesar, well, it might be a different Caesar actually, but I'm pretty sure it's Julius Caesar. He's not an idiot. He realizes this is a really strategic, good piece of land to hold on to. So what he does is he decides that he's going to resettle Corinth and he's going to make it this hub. Are we on the same page? Now, this is what I want you to know. Of all the cities in the Roman Empire, Corinth is very unique. It's a very powerful, very important city, but it has something going for it or against it, rather, that's very unique. It's that everyone who lives there is not from there. Everyone that lives there is settled intentionally. So do you guys remember this whole bit, like when the Babylonians would come and they would take over the Israelites? Often the first people they would take would be who? What? The cream of the crop. They would take the artisans. They would take the business people. They'd take the people who know how to get stuff done. So Rome starts settling Corinth with these type of people. And the city that emerges is an extremely wealthy city. It's a city that's exposed to every religious and spiritual movement. Like I said, lots of money. This is a place with the foods of the whole world. This is a place that's introduced to languages and cultures. One of the things Corinth has is one of the largest libraries in the ancient world. This is the kind of place it is. But it's also a place where nobody is from there, and it becomes, I would say, kind of ancient Las Vegas. And the catchphrase for Las Vegas is what? Sin City, and what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So what happens in Corinth stays in Corinth. So if you're going on a business trip and you're going to Corinth, there are a lot of opportunities to get into some pretty gnarly, sketchy business in Corinth. So let me tell you a little bit about those sorts of things. Actually, there's literally a Greek word that's to Corinthianize. That's a word in the Greek language. And what that means is to live in total and utter depravity with no consequences. So let me tell you about their depravity a little bit. One of the things that Corinth is famous for is a temple to a certain goddess. Does anybody know what it is? Aphrodite. Who knew that? What's that? Oh, That was your chance, Kevin. I just read it. You should have said, how did no one else know that? I've known that for ages. Okay, Aphrodite. Aphrodite is a goddess, and she is the goddess of love. She's not just the goddess of any love. She's the goddess of kind of sensual, over-the-top consumption love. And it's such a famous temple that people throughout the empire come to Corinth, and one of the things they do is they love the temple. Do you know why they love the temple? Because this temple houses 1,000 slave prostitutes. And they are part of the worship at this place. So imagine Las Vegas, imagine business trip. Every night the sun goes down and the temple prostitutes, they descend on Corinth and they go make money to keep the temple looking beautiful and big. Does that make sense? So this is the city that we're talking about. Another temple there, I can't remember the name, but it has this mystery kind of cultic environment. And one of the things they do is they drink this super sketchy liquor. I just think like moonshine. Anybody ever watch that show, Moonshiners? You guys ever see that show? I'm always mixed on shows where people are speaking English but need subtitles, and that's one of the shows. So this is what's going on. There is a temple there, and they're drinking this sketchy liquor, and some historians say they're probably using what we would call kind of ancient hallucinogens. And what they would do is they would work themselves into a frenzy, and they would see visions, and they would say weird things, and they were thought of as like wise, oracle-type people. And so they would work themselves up, and they would speak this nonsense that was supposed to be like their wisdom. Now, it is debatable whether people really thought that was wisdom or they just like propping it up because they liked a place they could go and do acid and drink or whatever they do there. I don't know. So this is the city that we're talking about. Everybody kind of got a good picture. Okay, this place, well-to-do, highly professional, highly suspect in their morals and values. Does this sound like any other place you've ever heard of? America. You want to like specify which part of America? What? Oh, we're on the line. Well, they can't hear your voice. They can only hear mine. Let's blame it on LA and not put our finger on ourselves. It's our neighbors to the north, right? Okay, so here's what I want you to see, is that Corinth becomes a hub of Christian kind of culture and Christian worship in the empire. It's so big, in fact, that Paul has 2 letters that are in our Bible to this church. And so before we just jump on the Corinthians, because they do some pretty messed up things, I think we have to realize the power of culture. And the reason I told you all of those things about Corinth is not just to get a history lesson. It's because sometimes I think we underestimate how powerful culture can influence faith. Very quickly, things can seep into our faith that is cultural, and it's actually the packaging of faith, but it's not faith itself. On top of that, when you're part of a culture that's sort of like, well, we'll allow it, it's not as bad as the rest of the culture, slowly over time, what starts to happen? A breakdown of morals, maybe permission to enter sinful behaviors without being called out. So these things begin to happen in Corinth. And it doesn't take long. Most historians say that before this 1 Corinthians letter, Paul, I think it's in Acts 18, he plants the church. He lives with these people for a year and a half. So it's not like a hit-and-run job. He goes, he works among them, he builds relationships with them, he teaches them the gospel, he raises up leaders who can teach and preach and lead this church. And then after a year and a half, he leaves. And historians pretty much unanimously are saying it's definitely less than 10 years since he planted this place. It's probably more like 5 years. So he plants this church, and the crown jewel of all the churches that he planted, imagine being called to go plant a church in that place, staying for a year and a half and feeling like, wow, by the grace of God, we succeeded. That would be pretty amazing, right? So it's this crown jewel. It's the greatest church that Paul could have planted in the sketchiest neighborhood, but then very quickly it becomes the greatest headache of all the churches. And so if you're following along, this letter is the correction letter. And here are some of the things that he is correcting. I read through the book and I came to at least 6 things that are just explicit. There's a lot of insinuation of some other things, but here are the 6 explicit things that Paul is writing to correct. The first thing he touches on is they're arguing over the apostles. So you might remember they're saying things like, well, I was baptized by Apollos, and I was baptized by Peter, and the sermons of Apollos are way better than Peter, and I take really good notes, so I know all of his theology. So they're doing this comparison thing. And they're almost becoming groupies around their favorite apostle, and what's happening is they're forgetting that who they are supposed to worship is Jesus. And what they're doing instead is they're looking at human wisdom and human ability, and they're kind of platforming that up to be equal with Jesus. And so Paul writes in and says, you got to knock this off. This is not what it's about. He even says, I intentionally didn't preach with my fancy words. I intentionally didn't put my fancy pants on when it came time to preach to you guys because I knew you would do this. That's more or less what he says. The second thing is, it says in chapter 3 that the Corinthians are being led by the flesh, so they're determining what is true and false based on how it feels. Does that sound familiar to anyone? If it feels good, do it, says the culture of some pagan society. Number 3, they're favoring some at the expense of others, so they're blatantly ignoring people in the worship gathering and propping up and favoring others. They have entered into grotesque sexual immorality. In fact, in chapter 5, Paul just blatantly says, I got to call this out, just call it what it is. There is a guy in your church who's sleeping with his stepmom while she's still married to his own dad, and you don't even see a problem with that. Pretty wild? Now, I don't want us to miss it. How many of you would say that's really wild? Now listen, I agree, it's very wild. But if you grow up into a culture where prostitutes are descending from the temple of Aphrodite every night and it's fully acceptable, you can see how morals and values become lax over time. So that's what he says. The 5th thing that I think is just blatant, and I think is actually really interesting, I wish we had more time, is that they're filing lawsuits against one another. They have these conflicts, and what they do is they file lawsuits. And what Paul tells them is, look, you clearly don't know God or the things of God if you're going to trust a secular court to determine who's right and wrong in your dispute. You can't even come together as brothers or sisters in Christ and work it out among you. You're going to trust some pagan guy in the courthouse to tell you what's right and wrong. And the 6th thing, I think, is the reason it's the last thing, it's chapter 11, is I think it's the most egregious, is it's kind of twofold. They're abusing the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, so much so that some people are sitting at the table and eating all the bread while other people literally go hungry. There are also people who are like, wow, we have temples that have taught us to get drunk on the liquor in the worship gathering, so let's drink all the wine. And there's people who are just drunk on the wine, which is crazy. Kind of in tandem with that is these people are also denying the resurrection of Jesus. And Paul says, look, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then everything you're doing is irrelevant and dumb, and it's a waste of your time. So that's a theological statement for you. Okay, so that's kind of the world that this letter is coming in. Any questions as we kind of pause? Nothing. Okay. Kevin.
All 6 of these things seem to be, history repeating itself.
History doesn't repeat itself, Kevin.
No, not ever. But no, through the late 20th century, all of these things.
Yeah.
In the church have happened.
Yeah. I think the sinful will of humans bends in a certain arc, and a lot of these things just will always come up. It turns out that humans, left to their own devices, will always pursue, if it feels good, do it in all of its forms, which is, I think, in one reason why the Bible is so adamant reminding, like that is to let your feelings be your barometer for what's true or not is a failing formula. The reason we have to be reminded of that is because it's not natural to live to the ways that God has created us to live. Yeah. But There's a reason Las Vegas exists. There's a reason people laugh when they say, what goes on there, right? Anybody ever driven through Las Vegas? Anybody ever, kind of like me, you almost just feel dirty just like looking at the billboards? Like, how are you supposed to drive through this city without feeling like you got like some of it on you? You know what I mean? Paul actually went to a place like that intentionally, lived there for 1.5 years, and left with a church planted. So props to Paul. Okay, so all of these things, and this is kind of the, I would say, the main theme of the letter. Paul, despite all these issues, takes a step back, and I think in just his maturity and wisdom says, look, everything I'm going to correct is a symptom of something larger. And the symptom is you're not unified. That's the whole letter. You have no unity. And the whole point that Paul wants to say is that we have to be unified under the lordship of Christ. If Christ is not the source of your morality, if he's not the source of what is true and what is not, it doesn't matter if I address that there's a guy sleeping with his stepmom. It doesn't matter if I address that people are getting drunk on the Eucharist. If we can't address this, then it won't matter. It's just going to fall apart. So right from the start, Paul decides, I'm not going to go at them on every little thing right off the start. I'm going to build this foundation that the whole point of this letter is to bring unity to the body. And because you're required to have unity in the body, then I can begin to address each one of these issues. Okay, the last thing before we go to chapter 13 is very interesting. If anybody have a hard copy Bible open? Somebody tell me in your Bible what the heading of chapter 12 says. Not 13, but 12. What is it? Okay, so we'll just call it spiritual gifts. What does chapter 13 say? So this is the love chapter. And then what does chapter 14 say? Okay. Tongues and prophecy. So it's more spiritual gifts. Okay. So we've talked about Corinth. We've talked about Paul's letter kind of at large. This is kind of the medium zoom. Now it's very interesting, because as you're reading this book, 1 Corinthians, you come to this chapter 12, and it's about the spiritual gifts. And basically, this is what's happening, and you can imagine the people I've been describing to you what they do. They look at the gifts, and they decide that there's some gifts that are better than others. And it's not like, wow, your gifts are better than mine. It's, my gifts are really good, and yours are off to the side. It's this boosting, it's this arrogant pride. And if I had to give a title to what Paul talks about with the spiritual gifts, by the way, this is the chapter of there's many parts, but there's one body. That's where this comes from. I would say what Paul says is that the spiritual gifts are not really worth talking about when you're worshiping the gifts and not the giver of the gifts. And so this is what he's addressing. He's saying there's become an issue, because as people are exercising spiritual gifts, and he lists many of them, words of wisdom, words of knowledge, faith, healing, miracles, prophecy, discerning spirits, speaking in tongues, and interpreting tongues, he says all of these gifts have become such a spectacle in your church body that it's almost become like this parade, this show, where you're showing off the gifts and you're worshiping the gifts, and all the while you have totally lost sight of worshiping the giver of the gifts. And so what he says is the gifts are for the building up and the unity of the body. The whole point of the gifts is to speak to the gospel of Jesus. It's to point people towards the gospel of Jesus. He says if the gifts are a distraction, don't even use them. The whole point of them is to bring edification and unity to the body so that people can worship, and you've made them into a distraction. And so this is where chapter 12 ends. I printed it out. This is how chapter 12 ends, and I think this is a good way to get into chapter 13. Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles and gifts of healing, helping, administrating, and various kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? These are rhetorical no questions. Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? but earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you a more excellent way. If you're taking notes, you can underline verse 31, because this is where I want to kind of leap off from. And I think this is important, even though tonight is not about spiritual gifts, it's about love. It's that, as we're going to see in a second, that without love as the foundation, all of the spiritual gifts are pointless. And the reason is because God is love. And to know God and to grow in your relationship with God is necessarily to grow in your love. And so he wants to say that everything is built on the foundation of love, and God is love. Now he says this kind of confusing thing, and I've done some digging. But earnestly desire the higher gifts. This is verse 31. And I will show you a still more excellent way. So here's my question. What are the higher gifts? Anybody want to take a stab at the higher gifts? Or should I just admit it's a trick question and no one will get it right? Here is my my locked-in answer, final answer. The highest gift of all in the church body for the building up of the body is, it depends. And it depends because every church is different and every church is in a different season. Does that make sense? So Paul is very, very, he likes this answer. He likes it because he's writing to a church that's trying to figure out who's better, whose gift is more important, who gets to stand up and prophesy during the worship service and who doesn't, whose words are actually wise and whose aren't. And what Paul is saying is that the greatest gift is for you to be quiet and take heed of what I'm telling you. That's a gift for you, to discern. And he's going to go in to say the greatest gift for you is discernment, and your discernment better land on love or you've missed the mark. But I would say when you read this and you say, what does it mean to pursue the higher gifts? Remember, he's not writing to you individually. He's writing to a church body. And he's saying the higher gifts require discernment and prayer for God to say, in this season, what is the gift that needs to be kind of pushed to the front? Maybe it's more biblical teaching. Maybe it's an emphasis on kind of theological correction. There's all these sorts of things that come into play. And then he says, and I will show you still a more excellent way. Anybody want to guess what the more excellent way is? Love. Nice. Which is chapter 13. So let's do chapter 13. We're going to end up at verse 4. We're going to talk about all these weddings that keep quoting the scripture wrong. And then we're going to leave us to brew on it. Chapter 13, verse 1. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels, but I have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Now, basically, every commentary I read said that the way that Paul is writing this sentence is not only correcting the Corinthian church, it's also taking a shot at that cult practice where they drink and take drugs and babble on. He's basically saying, you could speak in the tongue of men and angels. It doesn't matter. Nobody's impressed. Without love, it's literally, it's not even nothing. It's a distraction and an annoyance. You're a noisy gong, a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers, and I understand all the mysteries and all the knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. If I give all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, literally if I sacrificed myself, but have not love, I gain nothing. Pretty heavy words. If you had to just like paraphrase, what is he saying? What is it? Love first. And without it, everything else doesn't matter, right? Okay, this might be controversial, but I don't think it is, because not only does Paul pretty much say it, but Jesus says it. There's a passage, it's in Matthew chapter 7. These people come to Jesus, and he's talking about kind of the last days, and if you flip there, you can read it. It starts at verse 21. I'll actually, instead of paraphrasing it, I'll just read it to you, because we have the time. says this. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So what he's saying is just acknowledging me as the Lord, but not walking out the will of the Father, that's a contradiction. You can't just show up, say, I recognize your authority, and get into the kingdom of heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And we cast out demons in your name and did many mighty works in your name. And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. Now, I think this is the theme that Paul is picking up on. That without love, you can literally do very powerful spiritual things, and Jesus doesn't even acknowledge you, doesn't even know you. So what I'm getting at is this is not just like, oh, it's a good idea, we should have more love. It's without love, you are not a follower of Jesus. If you are not growing in your love, then you are not growing in your relationship with Jesus. And here's why. Because God is love. And if you're growing in your relationship with God, you are growing in your love. And we're going to see here in a second, love is not a feeling. This type of love has literally nothing to do with a feeling. This love is the self-sacrificial covenant love of, you ready for this? God. So this is what he says. Now I want to kind of cover something that I think is kind of good for a setting where we have a whiteboard. Because it turns out, and I hear this 2 or 3 times a year from people preaching, and I never get tired of hearing it, it's that in the Greek language, there are certain words that have a lot of nuance to them that we don't get in English. One of those words is dun, 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 love. And usually when I hear this taught, and it's always correct, it says, it goes something like this. This word in English is a terrible word. It's terrible because I love fresh baked bread, and I love watching the San Francisco Giants, and I love my children and my wife. You clearly see the problem. All the same word clearly does not mean the same thing in every circumstance. All on the same page? In Greek, there is, I think technically there's 6, but 2 of them are kind of more breakoffs. There's 4 main words for love. The first one is pronounced eros. This is where we get our English word erotic. So this is sensual love. This is the falling in love. This is pure, unadulterated, feels good feeling of love. I'm falling in love. I got goosebumps. This person can do no wrong because it just feels good. This is, frankly, this is sexual in nature most of the time. That's what this is. So this is, if we had to use an example, this is the Aphrodite love. This is the pure, pleasure-seeking love. Let's see, I don't want to miss anything. Okay, the second one is storge. This is interesting because I think the next 2 in our culture would be swapped a little bit. Storge is kind of the second level of love, and this is the familial love that just happens. This is you give birth to a child, and there's just something that clicks in you that this child can not do no wrong, but this child can't do anything to like lessen or gain the love that I have for it. Does that make sense? So this is kind of familial. I'm just going to write a good example is parent-child. I know this is not true in every case, but more or less this is the feeling. It's still a feeling, and it's a feeling like you didn't necessarily choose. It just happens. Is that more or less true? Okay, the third level of love is phileo. And this is kind of the platonic friendship love. Now, sometimes when we say this, we say friendship, we think, oh, well, that's not a very strong love because I have 5,000 friends on Instagram and I barely know any of them. That's not this. This is like David and Jonathan love. This is, in Greek thought, higher than storge because this type of love is chosen. It is saying that no matter what happens, I am choosing to be committed to you. Our love is platonic. It is loyal. even to a fault. Even if you mess up big time, I will stand by you. By the way, this is one of the things that the Bible speaks about, not directly, but it's insinuating. This is the disciples when Jesus is being crucified and they don't show up. They don't even have this level of love. Because they have said, what does Peter say? I will follow you. What does he say? More or less, I'd follow you all the way to death, right? I am phileo-ing you. And then it actually happens, and it shows that his commitment is for naught. The last type of love is agape. And what is agape love? This is the sacrificial. I'm going to call it the sacrificial. And I'm going to use the word covenant because I think this is going to be a good word to help us get to God's love. Covenant love. And how would you describe agape? Unconditional, like real unconditional. This is the highest form of love. This is a commitment and a choice that even in the worst circumstances, somebody will self-sacrifice for a cause or for the person or the thing that they love. Is that ringing true? So whose love is this? Jesus' love. Now this is very important because we're about to get to verse 4. The love that's described, agape love, and what we're going to be describing here is Jesus' love. Are we all on the same page? What we're about to read, you just got to try to push reset on your brain of all the weddings you've heard. This is the ideal love that we are growing towards as we are in relationship with God, as we are disciples of Jesus and we're walking out a relationship with him every day. We are heading towards this love, but this love is the person of Jesus. This is not we got married and everything we're about to read happens and we're all good. Make sense? How many of you are married or have been married, by the way? Okay, so this is going to ring true for you. So, let's see. I don't want to miss anything. Oh, yeah, let's talk about culture and love, because I think this is some good kind of takeaways as we follow Jesus. Let's see. So I want to talk about kind of the issues with agape love in our culture. And I think it's looking at us right in the face, but as we talk about it, I think this might kind of reveal itself a little bit more. What is our culture's issue going to be with agape love? Doesn't feel good. Doesn't always feel good. Most of the time it doesn't. Okay, so it doesn't feel good. X. You don't get the feels. Okay. What else? Self-sacrificial, self-giving love that is committed to that, whether you reciprocate or not. So what else is wrong here? I would say it doesn't reciprocate. It doesn't have to reciprocate. Let me tell you what I mean. Whether you've been married for 1 minute or 100 years, you know exactly how this works. The reciprocal love that you tell yourself, I'll never fall into that because that's not God's love. It's, you're not treating me very nicely, so therefore, deep inside of me, I feel like I have a smidgen of an excuse to not treat you well back. As simple as that. This type of love that we're going to read doesn't do that. It doesn't play those games. It doesn't say, I worked 15 hours. Why did you leave the dishes in the sink? It doesn't do that. It never does that. Now, here's the problem. Is I know this is a problem because I think young married couples, including myself, have pursued marital counseling on lots of things for lots of reasons. And this is 100% full support. If you're in a marriage and you are seeking counseling because you want to fight, that is awesome. But one of the issues often is that our culture, are you guys looking at each other? Is there a reason Cutie's sitting in between you two? It's that our culture, whether we like it or not, whether we recognize it or not, it's usually subconscious, has sunk down in there to the point where even as we follow Jesus for decades, this rears its ugly head and we realize this type of love is not fair. It doesn't seem fair. Why should I have to be giving 100% all the time when it seems like you're not giving anything? Why should I want to fight for something when you don't even want to fight for it? Why should I have to bring up the same conversation over and over and over while you nod and say, I'm listening, and then you don't do anything, right? Is this ringing true to anyone? And so this is a problem. It collides with how we understand love. I think a second part of our culture is that we are, one of the reasons we don't like it is we're the rugged individual culture. The way that the West was won was this image of a guy in a raccoon skin cap and a rifle just going off into the country and going to make a way in the world, right? So that's at the core of who we are. It's self-sufficient and it's me first. It's always seeking me first. So if we don't recognize it and we don't realize our default will always be me first, then we won't catch it until we've already mouthed off and we've already caused a conflict. That's what I would say. The second part I think about this that's important is that our culture promotes our gifts and our abilities to kind of make it on our own. We're skeptical of anything that would be self-sacrificial and free, right? Let me give you an example. I've been really, I would call it an obsession, but you're going to think this is really weird and give you insight into my introversion. But I've been watching these YouTube videos and they like put me in a trance. And it's this guy with a pressure washing business. I can't believe I'm saying this out loud. You watch it. Yes. This is what he does. He makes a ton of money on YouTube, so he drives around the neighborhood, finds the most disgusting, terrible driveways and fences and all this stuff. He knocks on the door, and he's like, I'd like to give you a full professional pressure washing treatment on your whole house for free. And guess what? Like 99% of the people's reactions is, no thanks. Why? We don't trust, right? I'd like to talk to you about a free vacation voucher I'd like to give you. What's your first response? See you later, right? Can you imagine if somebody at the county fair set up a booth that was like literally, hey, stop in right here. We'll give you an envelope with a real vacation voucher. How hard it would be for them to give away a free vacation? Why is that? It's trust. We are shaped by the culture that everybody is in it for themselves. So what's our first thought? What's in it for you? And even when the pressure wash guy says, there's nothing in it for me, they say, really? So I was just watching this episode. And I've only watched like 15 of them, so chill out. The guy's describing it. So he's saying, I know, I get it. It seems really odd. It really is a legitimate service. I can show you what I do. I have no interest in getting paid. I'm going to get paid, but it's going to be through the advertising on YouTube, all these things. And the guy's like, all right. And then he says at the end of the video that the guy comes and actually tries to pay him. And he says, I'm really sorry, but I actually called the local police department to ask if there was any pressure washing scams going on. Like, this is our skepticism about anyone who would self-sacrifice and give you something free, right? Are we on the same page? Okay, so we could talk about all of our timeshares we want to give each other after this. Okay, so I think we're on the same page. So now we're going to talk about the wedding verse. Verse 4. Your outline is a little different than mine. Is this one being used? It's yours. So there is a lot of words that I think bear having a definition in this chunk. And so I've done my best to give you like a Greek definition of what these words mean. But as I was just talking this out, I don't think it's overly fruitful to get caught in what the actual words mean, because most of these definitions in Greek more or less are conveyed well in English. Does that make sense? So if you're thinking like, are we going to talk about what the words mean? I've put them there for you. We might touch on a few, but we're not going to really go through each single one. And then a lot of you just like to see what the Greek language is, so I put it there for you as well. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4. Close your eyes, take a deep breath. Imagine a flowing white dress. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy and it does not boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things. It believes all things. It hopes all things, and it endures all things. Aw, right? That's usually how it's received. So let's first just have a little fun and talk about weddings. Does it say right and wrong or wrong and right on yours? Okay. I have fiddled with it quite a bit. At least I can attest to it. These didn't get printed till like 5:30. I was pacing back and forth in the sanctuary talking to myself. It's very awkward when that happens. I was very in my head today. Before we get in here, I just have to tell you a story because he's probably going to say it in a sermon, and so I might as well just get it out there so I don't look like an idiot. I'll read it to you. Today I was trying to text my wife. I didn't sleep well last night, and I was reading, so I was I was just kind of tired. My eyes were glazed over. And so at the workout studio my wife works at, they have these drinks called Celsius. It's an energy drink. So this is what I text. I said, will you please grab me a Celsius? I'm starting to drag trying to read on no sleep. Love you ahead of time for being the queen of caffeine. And then Danny responded, I love this. And I just screenshotted it and saved it under the Andy Black mail file. So that's where it's at. So I called him the queen of caffeine on accident. All that is to say that that's more or less why we're not going to go through all the words. Okay, so the wedding. So love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast. It is not arrogant, it's not rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing. It rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now here is where I think this verse has kind of taken a turn. It's because in the setting of a wedding, what do you feel like at a wedding? It's emotional, right? And this verse is not usually read at the beginning. It's usually read like right before a vow, for instance. So it's emotional. It's romantic. It's this very, I think this is important, special occasion. And so when the special occasion that's S's or C's, I don't know. Somebody Google it. Emotional, romantic, it's a special occasion, and out comes the 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 4 through 7, and what happens is we pair the emotion and the feeling of that moment with this verse. And so the wrong interpretation of this verse is that that verse that we just read should be this emotional, beautiful, romantic thing. The right way would be to say this, that agape love is a sacrificial covenant love. There will be days when you wake up and you are feeling like, I don't have any interest in loving that person. Guess what? Agape love says that doesn't matter. It's not a feeling. It's not a special occasion romantic thing. It is the nitty-gritty, the dirty work of saying, I am committing to loving you every day of your life, even when I'm a jerk, even when you're a jerk, even when you mess up and I don't feel like it, even when I mess up and I feel like I'm an idiot and I want to just like go sleep in the closet. It's every single day of saying, I will do the hard work, the self-sacrificial work, because agape love is not a feeling, it is an action. And it is an action that is on display in serving the other person. Now, here's where I think it gets a little mixed up. Even Christians let the culture come in a little bit. It's, I will serve you with all my heart, but I got to at least get something back. How many of you would like something back? How many of you would like a lot of something back? Yeah. The Bible does not say that that is a prerequisite for agape love. If you enter into a covenant agreement, you may have noticed this. Most Christian weddings talk about marriage more than they talk about wedding, and they talk about marriage as a covenant. The reflection is the way that Jesus loves his bride, which is the church. And how is the church in Corinth, let alone writ large, doing? It doesn't matter, because Jesus says, I have committed to covenantal love. I will always leave the 99 for you. So let's talk a little bit about what this looks like. We'll get there in a second. Okay, so we talked about this love. This love is God's love. Now, how are we doing with love, by the way? We got it all? No resentment, no anger, always patience, right? Or I like the word better, long-suffering, because it just gets to the point, right? You tracking with me? This is not the love that you hold your spouse accountable to. It's not saying, here we are, you got to live up to this. I printed it out and I put it in your Bible as a bookmark so you can't forget. That's not this. This is together, hand in hand, we are going towards Jesus, and this is his love for us. And by his grace, we can extend it to one another. And part of that love in human form is when we mess up, how do we love like Jesus? We extend forgiveness. We extend reconciliation. I'm willing to work this out. And as a human, this might be difficult, and it might be hard for me for a while, but I'm committed to making it happen, right? We have an issue of letting the culture seep in, and I always harp on this because I literally think this might be one of the worst cultural things that have happened to this country ever. It's called no-fault divorce. Everybody know what no-fault divorce is? It's, hey, that love we committed to and said we were going to do it forever in front of 400 of our friends, and we got it on video, and it's on YouTube for the world to see. I don't feel like doing that anymore. Boom. This wreaks havoc on kids. It wreaks havoc on cultures and people's emotional well-being and physical well-being. This is a terrible, terrible thing. But here's the problem. This is the culture, and unfortunately, Christians have fallen into this trap as well. Maybe it's fallen into, well, the culture might get a divorce a little quicker. I've tried to tough it out for 3 years, and I've just had enough, right? Just so you know, this is not in the outline, but we have time. Anybody ever read this book, Hosea? If you want a sober idea of what it's like for Jesus to be in relationship with us, you should read Hosea. Anyone want to give a synopsis of Hosea? God says, hey, Hosea, I want you to have a living example and reminder of what it feels like to be the God of Israel. So I want you to do what? I want you to marry a prostitute, and then I don't want you to correct her. I just want you to let her continue with her life. Yikes. I thought we were trying to do 1 Corinthians 13, right? That's what God says it's like keeping a covenant with these people. It's just constantly astray, constantly awry, constantly in disobedience. But guess what? God always, always holds his end of the covenant. This is his love for us, and by his grace, we can extend it to one another. So I was looking at this list. Love is patient, love is kind, and all the words. And this is some of the things that I thought of. Love is patient. Think about Jesus' relationship with his friend Peter. You call that patient? Anybody else have that type of patience? This is the type of patience, not just like on a piece of paper or like theoretical of this is how we're supposed to be patient, or is it long-suffering? Here's what. I don't care what the word is. What it looks like is Jesus loving Peter. Love is kind. I love these verses where it says that Jesus was moved with compassion. He's tired, he's exhausted, but he looks out and he thinks, this is not about me, this is about extending the love of Jesus and the kingdom of God to those who are in need. I don't care what the word means, this is what it looks like. And I'm not telling you that you should just drop all your boundaries and you shouldn't have boundaries and you should just let people knock on your door like they do to him. I am saying that if you don't ever drop any boundaries or step out, you will never be stretched in this part of the love that God calls you to. It does not envy. It does not boast. Imagine what Jesus could boast about. Hey, remember how I saved the entire universe and the entire creative order? Remember how you were all going to go to hell until I showed up? Just saying, right? How many of you would be tempted to play that card from time to time if that was you? Yeah. It is not arrogant. It is not rude. It does not insist on its own way. This idea of insisting on your own way is being in control. Any control freaks? Anybody? Yeah. It does not insist on its own way. Can you think of something that was that on display in the life of Jesus? Death, even death on a cross. Was Jesus out of control? He wasn't out of control, but he allowed control to be taken over him. He allowed himself to be arrested. He allowed himself to have nails driven into his hands. It's not irritable or resentful. While they were crucifying him, he looks out at them, and what does he say? You nasty, no good Romans. That lightning storm is going to strike you down. That is not what he says. What does he say? Father, forgive them. Even as they're murdering him, he does not hold resentment or anger towards them, the exact opposite. So what does it look like to not be irritable or resentful? It's not to hold anything against them, even to the point of forgiving somebody who's actively wronging you. It rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Okay, we've talked a lot about this. What's in it for me? I want to talk a little bit about a couple examples of what this love looks like, because I think that's the question. I think one of the conflicts we can have reading Paul's letters especially, actually, quick poll. How many of you love Paul's letters? How many of you are like, I'm a little meh? A little meh. That's kind of me. Here's one of the problems I have, is I feel like my natural bent is a little bit more like head over heart. And I feel like Paul is not always good for me because a lot of this is like theoretical, philosophical. He's got big words. He's got these long run-on sentences that are like legal arguments. He's very smart. He's convincing people theologically through things. So it's very much like up here. But I think if we pause and we think, what do these things look like in real life? We realize what Paul is saying. Like, what he's saying about love is these are not just like good, nice words that we put on a page. This is his description of Jesus. Jesus who was a human and what it looks like. And so here are some examples. Because I think we have to be connected to this source of love, or this is just a pipe dream and it will never happen. We won't grow in it because we can wake up, like Paul already said, you could cast out demons in Jesus' name. You could prophesy, you could speak in tongues, but have no love, and it is nothing. That word nothing, by the way, is like completely erratic. It's like literally you're nothing. Pff, gone. It's irrelevant. It's a blip. It doesn't mean anything. So what does it look like to be connected to this source of love? What are the things Jesus does? I love this teaching. He says, I would leave the 99 for the one. Let's talk about this teaching for a second. We'll talk about our culturally. What would our culture say about leaving 99 for one? I heard a sermon illustration. I can't remember who it was, so forgive me. But it was basically this. In the ancient world, sheep are money. They're literally a walking dollar bill. Okay? So imagine you have 100 $1 bills, and you just leave 99 of them on the ground while you go out into the world to look for the one. What does our culture say about that? Dumb, stupid, foolish. Literally, there's no justifiable way to make sense of that, right? And Jesus says the only way that you would accept that is if you were the one. And I will always leave the 99 for the one, right? Because the well-being of the 99 is not a concern when I know for certain one needs me. This is the running father in the prodigal son. Here's another example. This love touches lepers. Anybody know anything about kind of like Jewish law and culture about lepers? Yeah. Don't touch, yeah.
Yeah, if you do, then you are unclean.
Yeah. So if I have no leprosy and I touch someone with leprosy, I am deemed unclean, unfit to be in the temple until I do all the ritualistic washing. Right? Does Jesus know that? He, as a rabbi, sacrifices everything religiously and culturally of people are going to think I'm unclean. And guess what? He doesn't care about what people think. And I love what he does because he touches the leper before he speaks to him. He tells him, look, I'm a rabbi. You can see I'm a rabbi. You've come to me because you know I'm a rabbi. I'm willing to touch you. Physical contact to someone who doesn't get any of it. And now I want to speak to you. That's what this love looks like. Here's a couple more, and then we'll move on. This love washes feet. I could be wrong. I didn't look it up. I just sort of forgot. But I'm pretty sure one of the accounts says, and then he showed the full extent of his love. So what's the deal with washing feet? I looked it up this week, just what the custom was all about. I didn't know this, but oftentimes the slave that washed feet was being punished. This slave was being punished for disobedience or whatever it might be, and so they were assigned to literally the worst possible task in the household. Just imagine people walking dirt roads in an agricultural world with sandals on for 10 hours a day, and you can just imagine what people's feet looked like, right? Anybody already anti-foot? There's a lot of you, I know. I try to wear socks because I have hobbit feet, like legitimately looks like Frodo Baggins. But you didn't need to know that. Maybe on Ohana Sunday I'll wear flip-flops and you guys can validate or... So here, what's the deal with washing feet? He takes on the form of the slave, the servant, the lowest of the lowest of the low, and does the task that not even the lowly servants want to do. And he says, this is how I show my love. How? By taking on the epitome of the absolute servant who has nowhere further to fall. This is the lowest you can get. I'm willing to go all the way to that point to serve you, right? The last one is one we all intuitively know. What kind of love is this? Dies on a cross. This is the epitome of the self-sacrificial covenantal love of God. That he would subject himself to death he doesn't deserve as an innocent human being that never sinned, death he doesn't deserve at the hands of pagans. And he does that. That's what love looks like. So in the Bible, when it says, take up your cross and follow me, and we try to spiritualize it, I think we're missing the point. I think the point is Jesus is saying, on this journey with me, you should be prepared to even have a death like me, if that's what it comes to. We've talked about this because we just finished Peter not that long ago. How does Peter die? He dies on a cross, and he's like, I don't want to die like Jesus. Hang me upside down. Yeah, this is what it looks like. So I think the big question, how many of you want to live like that? How many of you want to live a life of love that powerful? I do too. But I think there's a big question that has to be discussed. And it's going to come all the way back, are you ready for this? To our culture that shaped us. So how do we do it? I think to get to the answer of how, I think we can talk about some of the obstacles to doing it. What are some of the big obstacles of trying to love like that in our world? Fear. Okay. Explain that one. I wasn't expecting that.
Fear of reprisal, fear of rejection, fear of
Oh, yeah. I would say there's an element of fear of, I think there is in some circles kind of this like political religious marrying where if you love the wrong people, the outsider group, you're kind of like told you don't belong in the insider group anymore. Like those people are our enemies. We are supposed to love them, but not like actually do it, right? Anything else? What's preventative? What's preventing us? What's that?
If you do those things, because of the culture the way it is right now, you're pushed aside, and I guess the rejection part, but it's called woke now. You're woke, you go along with it.
Oh, wokeness. All right, so there's some. Okay, what else? Yeah.
I get in the way.
The great I with no am, right? What do you mean by that? Because I'm the same, but I'm curious.
Like, I hate unfairness.
Yeah. Keep going.
Let go of it.
Yeah,
Hard to forgive.
because it's not fair. Yeah, we talked about this, that I told you I had read that study that one of the first things in all cultures that all kids say on the playground is, it's not fair. Right? That's like embedded in our sin nature of this is not fair. So if we can't get over that, we're never going to get to agape. How about this? This is just a pure confession. I want to love like this. And I'd say I'm guilty often of saying, all right, I got it. I woke up today. I'm committed to it. I'm going to do it. It's the self-dependency. I think that's part of the I. Self-dependence, self-reliance. This is the, I can get a lot of stuff done. I can be very productive. I can work really hard. I'm going to work really hard, and I'm going to make this happen. Right? How's that going to work? How many of you would say over or under 10 minutes? How many of you are like, I could do it for 10 minutes? I think I could go 10 minutes. And honestly, we're laughing. I think that's part of the problem. Because if you're someone that's like, I can't even do it for 1 second, what are you apt to do? To say, God, there's no way I can even do this for 1 second. And so you have a reliance and dependence on the Lord, which is where all of this is going, right? The how you do it is you have to be in step with God. You have to be. Because that description of love is not for you just to go get and make it happen. That description is love of who? That's God's love. The only way you can possibly get that love is if you're in step with God and God is doing an act of grace in your heart. There's no way you're just going to go get that on your own. Although I do have like a little pushback because like kids can develop patience in you faster than anything else, right? So there is like, but this is how God works. Is it's not, once I figure out Paul's theological concept and I map it all out and I define all the words, then I'm going to get to work building this for myself so I can live into the love that God has for us. What Paul would say is set everything aside and recognize that without daily dependence on him, you already failed. There's literally no way that you can do this without a constant. It's why the Bible says that you should pray without ceasing. This is the constant, I need you, I need you. I love that old hymn, I need thee every hour. Every hour I need thee. It's just repeating, and then you sing it and it's stuck in your head, and then you realize, wow, that's the most true of all the hymns I sung today. I need thee every hour I need thee, over and over and over. So I just wrote this down. This could be a prayer, this could be something you recite. God, I am incapable of loving like you today without you. Remind me, lead me, help me. Man, if I repeated that every hour, I think things would start to change. You'd realize there's no way you're doing this on your own. There has to be a connection to the source, a connection to the living water. God is inviting us to the fountain of living water that doesn't run dry, and it's available to everyone, even the woman at the well. It's available to everyone as long as they lay aside their pride and say, I can't get there on my own. I'm back again. I want more. Verse 8 says this. Love never ends. It's eternal is what it's saying. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now, we see in a mirror dimly. You can check out that footnote, it's kind of interesting. But then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. I think that last part is I'm going to look in the clear mirror and get a real idea of who I am, but that mirror is going to look back and fully know me too. Isn't that cool? So here's the idea. The idea is this, is that love is eternal, that even the spiritual gifts pass away. Now, I read that this week and I thought, oh, I need to step back and write this down because I'm not sure if I'm like theologically committed to that being true or not. Anybody else hear that and think, wait, what? Is that a real thing? The spiritual gifts pass away. This is why, and this is why Paul says it. It's because he's already made it very clear that all the spiritual gifts are to build up the body of Christ, to promote unity and cohesion so that they will worship the Lord, that they would be in, what was the term I used earlier, that they would be, what's that? Yeah, they'd be unified in Christ. They'd be unified under the lordship of Christ. That's what the gifts are for. It's to promote kingdom. It's to promote the gospel of Jesus, that it's proclaimed and it's preached. It's why he says, if it's getting in the way, set aside the spiritual gift and just keep it to yourself. Why? Because the central thing is Christ and Christ crucified. It is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that is central. It's the gospel message. If there's nothing else happening, it's that every single time. And the reason the spiritual gifts pass away is because they are pointing towards Jesus. And when he returns, there's no longer a need to point towards him because you're with him. He doubles down on it. He says, when the perfect comes. I'm going to pass. When the perfect comes, what does that mean? What does it mean for the perfect to come? Say that again? Yeah, when Jesus returns. The second coming, right? When Jesus returns, what is the term? The perfect has arrived, right? Okay, so Jesus returned. All these things will pass away, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. So all the things that are pointing to the reality of Jesus' return, they're no longer necessary when Jesus has returned. Does that make sense to everyone? For when I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. We're just not going to have time. But for we see in a mirror dimly. So I was curious about this dimly thing, and I just started looking it up. Turns out Corinth was a huge manufacturer of mirrors in the ancient world, which is brilliant. Paul, he lived there for a year and a half. He knows how the culture works. He knows what's going on, and he uses illustrations people can understand. Their mirrors were highly polished metal. And so even the very best mirrors could reflect, you could see in part, but even the very best mirrors were still blurry, which is interesting. So he says, for now, we see in a mirror dimly. Well, yeah, everyone who has a mirror knows what that means in the first century. But then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. I will know the full extent of God's love when he returns, and I will realize I was fully known. I think the idea of the gifts passing away again is Paul's emphasis throughout 1 Corinthians, that the gifts are amazing, they're a gift from God, but they are not to be worshipped. You are not to worship the gifts, you are to worship the giver. If they become a distraction, then you've missed the point. Verse 13, so now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. The word abide here just means they remain. When all else passes away, what remains? Faith, hope, and love. But he says something interesting there. And to be honest, this is a full confession, especially to Lisa. This is why I was not done until 5:15 with this. Because why is love greater? Faith, hope, and love, but the greatest is love.
Faith and hope are realized when we're in peace.
What? I should have just called you. It would have spared me a lot of time. Say it again really loud.
Well, now we live with faith and hope in God when for the future we're turning them. But when we're there, we're going to realize.
Okay. But for real, I'm like low-key irritated by you. Because I'm like, why is love better than, like, why is this the list? Faith, hope, and love, and the greatest is love. Like, beautiful, wonderful, but like, what does that mean? What you just said is exactly what I came to, is that the reason we have faith is, what do we have faith in? We have faith in Jesus. And what is our faith rooted in? It's Him, but also that we have hope. Our faith and hope are connected in what? That there's eternity, that He's coming back, that what He said will happen, who He is, who He said He is who He is, right? Faith and hope. But when He returns, we don't have to have faith in Him anymore because it's fully realized. It's faith fully realized. And we don't have to have hope in the future because we now live in eternity and there's no past, present, or future. It's eternity, right? So why does love remain? God is love. And we, as kingdom people, when He returns, we will love in its fullness. And what will our expression of love be? Pure, undefiled. Now, I love this. Because what Paul said is that then, this is verse 12, when we see Him face to face, I know now in part, like I know Jesus. I don't know Him fully, but when I see Him face to face, I shall know fully. When you see God without the barrier of sin and brokenness, and you see Him for who He is, what is your response? Worship. Now, I used to hear teenagers say this all the time when I was doing youth ministry for a decade. That sounds kind of boring. So we're just going to sing and worship? We could go down a rabbit trail. I don't think we're just going to sing our worship. I think we're going to live in the perfect creation that God intended, and everything we do will be an act of worship. But even the idea of we're just going to sing and worship all the time, it sounds boring, is totally missing the point. It's missing the point of, well, the reason you think that is because you haven't seen Him fully, right? The reason you think that is because you think that worship in your mind is just like a little, like 3 songs and then a sermon. Worship is everything. You will live every part of life. Even your interaction with one another will be pure. It will be patient, kind, all of those things. So I think here are the takeaways, and I think this is maybe something that we could respond to. I think that this type of love 100% requires a supernatural act of grace in your heart. So I think if you take anything away from 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7, I hope it would be this. Stop trying to do it on your own. It is a futile, uphill battle. You could very well be doing the exact same thing in 10 years and then sit down in a similar Bible study, learn the same thing, and be like, oh man, I wasted 10 years trying to love like God without depending on Him. You can't do it on your own. I get how the culture has shaped you. I get that many of you can go to work and you don't need anything. You don't need any help. You have the expertise. You're really, really good. You're really organized. You're a hard worker. You can do it on your own. That does not in any way mean that you can do your relationship with God on your own. You cannot. I think the second thing is this, is that this type of love it is an action. And when I say action, what I really mean is it's primarily an action of service. we have a huge problem. It's not only happening, it's brewing greater every day, and it's that there is a whole entire world out there that is saying that love is a feeling. I think it's even swung further than that and said, truth is a feeling. I could tell you right now that if you pursue love as a feeling, you will live in perpetual disappointment. You will be constantly chasing the next thing. It will never end. It will be a hamster wheel that never ends. If you're rich enough, you might end up being one of those 90-year-old Forbes guys who's married to a 30-year-old woman, and it's your 15th marriage, and you're still trying to get this. It's empty. It doesn't mean that agape love never has a feeling. I think one last thing that I want to just say before we end. Part of loving someone else, and this is hard for many people who are self-sufficient, part of loving somebody else is giving them room to love you. It is a bulldozer agape to say, like, I'm just going to serve you all the time. Serve, 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 serve. But then you realize that gives the other person, if it's a marriage relationship or a friendship or whatever it might be, it gives them zero space to love you back. Does that make sense? There has to be both. And it can't be like, well, when do we do it and when do we not? I can't tell you, because this is 100% driven by the Spirit of God, not by some algorithm or something that you can just like plug in and spit out the right output. It doesn't mean that sometimes serving people doesn't feel good. I would argue that as we grow in our agape love, serving people that used to stink and feel terrible slowly starts to feel good. Do you know why? Because it's God's love in you, and you start to feel the feeling of obedience, not carnal pleasure. So you grow in feeling like the thing that brings me the most pleasure is obedience to God. Maybe I went on a mission or a service trip into a place that made me really uncomfortable, but it felt really good to do that. Not because it brought you pleasure, but because you were living into an obedient lifestyle that God called you to. Here are my last thoughts, and we can just wrap up here. I was thinking about, like, what does that mean for us? And I think this is an encouragement, but it's also like a job well done. There is, I think Breck said it, there's going to be a lot of people who don't get that don't understand. But I have to believe that if we are people who live out agape love, and we're growing in it every day, we're going to run into a lot of people who are like, man, I don't get them at all. I don't know how they believe what they believe. I don't understand what they're about at all, but I sure am glad they're around. I wish there were more of them. As weird as that is, because I don't understand the book that they read, I don't understand the religious worldview, the ethics, the morals, but everywhere they go, it seems like things are better, and I kind of want more of them around. I want to be part of people like that. It's like it just smacks of Jesus in a way that's like so enticing that people are like, I don't get it, but you got something I desire deeply. I'd love to pray, and then we'll just dismiss and hang out if you'd like. God, thank you for your love. God, thank you that this is not a philosophy class where we just talk around in circles and definitions and words, but we can look to your Son Jesus and just see what it looks like. And God, we have fallen deeply in love with him. We desire to be like him. So God, help us. Help us to connect to the source more often. Help us to not be hard on ourselves when we fall short, but recognize that love is your love for us, and it's grace and forgiveness for those who ask. But God, I do pray for the hard work, for the stretching, for the discomfort that happens from time to time. And I pray that maybe in the course of weeks or months we would look back and we would recognize we have grown a great deal. So God, would you give us the pleasure to do your will? Would obedience just be the thing that brings us joy in our hearts? Thank you for all that you've done for us. Would we never lose sight of it? Would we never try to do it on our own? And would we be a people that encourages each other and reminds each other often? Amen. Amen.